Do you remember where you were 6 years ago today, October 10th, 2018? Yeah. Think about that for a second. If you were anywhere near Florida's Panhandle, that date probably brings back some pretty rough memories, huh? Hurricane Michael, Category 5, the one that changed everything in just a few hours. 6 years. Crazy how time flies, right? But for the folks who lived through it, it's probably felt like a lifetime. I mean, homes were gone, neighborhoods wiped out, and entire towns, well, they're still recovering. And we're not talking minor damage here. We're talking about a storm so powerful it shredded communities like Mexico Beach and Panama City, leaving nothing but debris and heartache behind. But here's the thing. Even though it's been 6 years since Michael made landfall, the story isn't over. The scars, both physical and emotional, are still there. And today we're going to dive deep into what happened back then and why it still matters today. So grab a cup of coffee or maybe something stronger. This is going to be a ride through one of Florida's most devastating storms and the aftermath that continues to shape life in the Panhandle.
Welcome to Old Florida Now, where we uncover the rich history and hidden stories of the Sunshine State. Each episode will explore the people, places, and events that shaped Florida's past. Let's dive in.
All right, so let's go back to the beginning of this whole thing. You might remember that Michael didn't exactly start as this monster hurricane, right? I mean, the storm was kind of sneaky. It started off as a what do they call it? Disturbance. Just a little weather disturbance down in the Caribbean around the start of October 2018. No one thought it'd be a big deal at first, but here's the wild part. Over just a few days, it went from this nothing storm to like a full-blown Category 5 hurricane. I mean, that escalation was insane. I think it was officially declared a tropical storm around October 7th. And then by the 10th, boom, it's barreling toward Florida as a monster. And there were a couple of factors that made this storm blow up so fast. One of them was the warm water in the Gulf. It's like fuel for hurricanes. And the other was something called diffluence. Now, I'm not a meteorologist or anything, but it's basically when the air at the top of the storm spreads out, letting the storm below intensify like super fast. So while most of us were just going about our regular days, this storm was brewing into one of the most powerful hurricanes Florida had ever seen. And nobody really saw it coming until it was too late. Okay, so here we are. October 10th, 2018, Hurricane Michael is now a full-blown Category 5 just off the coast, and it's coming in hot. And, hot, we're talking 155 mile per hour winds. This thing was an absolute beast. And where does it hit? Mexico Beach, poor Mexico Beach. Man, that place took the brunt of it. You've got storm surges like 14 to 15 feet high, water just swallowing up homes and businesses along the coast. I mean, there was no stopping it. It's like 1 minute you got a town and the next you got, nothing. It's just debris everywhere. The power of those winds, it's hard to wrap your head around. But when they were combined with that storm surge, there was no way that those coastal buildings stood a chance. And it wasn't just Mexico Beach. Tyndall Air Force Base was basically ground zero too. Every single building on that base saw some form of damage. Roofs torn off, windows shattered, just complete chaos. Even some of the infrastructure we think of as, solid and immovable was just torn apart like it was nothing. And get this, the damage didn't stop at the coast. You've got hurricane force winds hitting as far inland as Georgia and even parts of Alabama. Yeah, we're talking hundreds of miles away from landfall, and people are still feeling the fury of this storm. I mean, when a storm is that powerful, distance barely matters. You're not safe even if you're a few states away. All right, so let's talk about the human toll, because this storm, it wasn't just about property or money, it was lives. Hurricane Michael ended up causing 59 deaths, and most of those were right here in Florida. I mean, it's one thing to hear about the destruction, the winds, the storm surge, but when you realize people didn't make it through, that hits different. And speaking of hitting different, the financial toll, over $25 billion in damages. billion. Homes gone, businesses wiped out. And then there's agriculture, which is huge for that part of the state. It feels just like flattened, trees snapped like matchsticks. A lot of folks lost their livelihood along with their homes, and some are still trying to rebuild even 6 years later. You can't really put a price on that kind of devastation, right? But 25 billion kind of paints the picture, doesn't it? All right, now let's dive into the environmental side of things, because Hurricane Michael didn't just mess with towns and homes. It literally reshaped the land. Take Mexico Beach, for example. The storm surge just wiped out entire sections of the beach. Dunes gone, shorelines completely different now. And it wasn't just Mexico Beach. Nearby areas were hit just as hard. Those natural barriers we rely on, the dunes and sandbar, they took a beating, and some never really came back the same. Now, this wasn't just a beach day ruined kind of thing, right? We're talking long-term environmental changes here. The forest losses were massive. Trees were snapped or uprooted, whole forests flattened. And when you think about it, that's not just some trees down, that changes ecosystems. The wildlife that depended on those forests had to either adapt or move on. And a lot of species, they just didn't make it. And the marine impact, man, the debris and pollutants from all the destruction, they ended up in the ocean. Coastal habitats, reefs, seagrass beds, they were like overwhelmed. And with all that junk in the water, it's not just the big stuff like buildings and cars, it's chemicals too. That's a slow burn on the marine life. And even 6 years later, we're still seeing the effects of that in the water. So after Hurricane Michael blew through, one of the biggest issues people faced was the housing crisis. I mean, we're talking thousands of homes just gone. Like, they weren't even there anymore. Whole neighborhoods wiped out. And when that happens, you're left with a ton of folks who've got nowhere to go. What that did was, because this huge spike in rent prices, all of a sudden, there's a lot more people needing places to live and way fewer homes available. So you've got families, some of them who lost everything, now being priced out of the few places left. It's just a mess. And rebuilding, that didn't exactly happen overnight either. You had labor shortages. There just weren't enough workers to go around, and then insurance disputes, like people fighting with their insurance companies over what would be covered and what wouldn't. That stuff really slowed things down. Rebuilding a home or a community isn't just about having the money. It's about having the people, the materials, and sometimes the patience to get through all that red tape. So even now, 6 years later, some folks are still trying to rebuild their lives. It's just been this long, drawn out process. Now, let's talk about what happened to the local businesses after Michael hit. And it wasn't pretty. Tourism is a big deal in the Florida Panhandle, especially for places like Mexico Beach and Panama City. But after the storm, everything was just gone. Hotels, restaurants, shops, these places were either totally destroyed or, if they were lucky, badly damaged. And when your whole economy depends on visitors, well, there's no visitors if there's nowhere for them to stay, right? And it wasn't just the big businesses feeling the pain. Small businesses, man, they really struggled. A lot of them were hit hard trying to just get back on their feet. You'd think there'd be all this help pouring in, but turns out it wasn't that easy. Recovery funds, those were tricky to access. There was so much paperwork, delays, red tape, all the usual stuff that slows things down when folks need it the most. For some small businesses, reopening wasn't even an option. They just couldn't afford it. And honestly, a lot of them never came back. And that, of course, rippled out. Less places open, fewer jobs, and more people leaving town to find work elsewhere. It's been tough. And even now, some businesses are still trying to recover from that one storm. So after the storm hit, it wasn't just a matter of picking up the pieces. There were like a lot of pieces to pick up. And that's where the local communities and volunteers really stepped up. You had people from all over coming down to help clean up. Churches, nonprofits, local organizations, they were right there from day one, handing out meals, setting up shelters, all that good stuff. But as much as the community pulled together, they couldn't do it alone. Federal aid was supposed to come in and help with the heavy lifting, but navigating that system wasn't exactly easy. There's all this red tape and paperwork. People were stuck waiting weeks, months even to get the help they needed. Insurance claims, forget about it. There were disputes left and right about what was covered and what wasn't. And that just slowed down rebuilding for a lot of families. It's one of those situations where you think, after a disaster this big, help would just flow in, but it wasn't that simple. And even when federal funds finally started rolling in, it wasn't always enough, or it didn't get to people fast enough. Meanwhile, you've got volunteers doing whatever they can to keep things moving. Honestly, they're the reason some places even made it through those first few months after Michael. So rebuilding the infrastructure after Michael, man, that was a massive project. We're talking roads, bridges, power grids. All of it was either damaged or completely wiped out in some areas. And, without that stuff, you can't really get back to normal. Communities were cut off. Power was out for weeks, even months in some places. It's hard to imagine, but this wasn't just fixing a few potholes or stringing up a couple of power lines. It was like starting from scratch in some parts of the Panhandle. And the rebuilding didn't happen overnight. They had to rethink how to do it too. After seeing how bad the damage was, especially from the wind and storm surge, they put in stricter building codes to try and prevent this kind of devastation from happening again. Now, homes and businesses that are being rebuilt have to meet tougher standards, higher foundations, stronger materials, and all that. Same with the power grids. They've been reinforced, and hopefully they're a lot more resilient now. But I'll be honest, even with all those efforts, the recovery is still ongoing. A lot of roads and public utilities have been fixed up, sure, but there's still so much to do. It's been 6 years, and in some areas it feels like progress is slow, but hey, it's a start. Hey, all right, let's talk about the environment, because the damage that Hurricane Michael left behind wasn't just to homes and roads. Nature took a pretty big hit too. I mean, entire forests were just flattened, thousands of trees gone in an instant. And when you lose that many trees, it's not just an eyesore, it's an ecological disaster. So one of the big efforts that kicked off after Michael was large-scale reforestation. There's been this push to restore those forests with like thousands of trees being planted to replace what was lost. And it's not just about making the place look pretty again. It's about bringing back the ecosystems that were destroyed. You've got wildlife that depends on those forests. So without them, a lot of species were, left scrambling. And it wasn't just the forests, coastal habitats, reefs, marshlands. They all got messed up too. So you've got other environmental recovery projects aimed at cleaning up debris, restoring these marine ecosystems, and trying to bring some balance back to the area. It's been a slow process, and a lot of this stuff takes years to bounce back, but those efforts are still ongoing. Honestly, it's kind of incredible when you think about how much of a long-term commitment this kind of restoration is 6 years later, and they're still working on it. But hey, step by step, right? Now, if there's one thing that stands out about the aftermath of Hurricane Michael, it's the resilience of the communities. I mean, yeah, this storm knocked folks down, but it sure didn't knock them out, especially in places like the Forgotten Coast, which kind of lives up to its name, right? It's this stretch of Florida that's always been a little off the beaten path. And even after all the destruction, the people there were determined to keep that identity alive. And you had neighbors helping neighbors, people coming together to clear debris, rebuild homes, and in a lot of cases, just figure out what to do next. Local businesses, despite everything, started reopening, sometimes in makeshift buildings or trailers, just to get a sense of normalcy back. And the community really rallied around the idea of preserving what makes the Forgotten Coast unique. It's not like they just wanted to rebuild any old way. They wanted to keep that small town feel, that sense of history and charm, even as they were preparing for the next big storm. So you see a lot of efforts to not only rebuild homes, but to do it smarter, stronger, while holding on to that identity. And I think that's what makes this whole recovery story so incredible. It's not just about bouncing back. It's about doing it in a way that honors what was there before while getting ready for what's coming next. You can feel the pride in these towns when you visit. Like, yeah, we're still here and we're not going anywhere. So as we look back 6 years later, it's clear that Hurricane Michael didn't just blow through and leave. Its impact is still very much felt in the Florida Panhandle. Entire communities were reshaped, both physically and emotionally. Homes, businesses, schools, lives were changed forever. And for a lot of folks, the recovery, it's still happening. We're talking long-term efforts to rebuild homes, restore the environment, and get people back on their feet. One of the big lessons from Michael, I think, is just how important storm preparedness really is. We saw it then, and we see it now, especially with, the storms aren't just getting more frequent, they're getting stronger. So the way communities rebuild, stronger homes, better infrastructure, tighter building codes, that's crucial for facing whatever's next. But as much as we focus on resilience and bouncing back, it's important we don't forget the ongoing struggles. People are still fighting to rebuild their lives, their businesses, their communities. So I think it's worth taking a moment, even now, 6 years later, to remember them, to recognize what they've been through and what they're still going through. All right, folks, that's it for today. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive into one of Florida's toughest chapters. Let's not forget the Panhandle and the people who call it home. Catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to Old Florida Now. Stay tuned for more stories from the Sunshine State's past. Until next time.